Thank you for joining us this evening for this very important conversation. My name is Ajamu Baraka, and I'm going to be both moderating and providing a short commentary. So just to get us into this, the topic tonight is for us to examine, to take a look at the situation with Guantanamo. And we're going to connect up the ongoing situation with Guantanamo and Guantanamo Bay. But we're going to connect that also to looking at the role and the presence of the U.S. In the Caribbean and Latin America area in general. So we're going to open up the conversation, raise the awareness of some real concerns that many of us have regarding the ongoing and in some cases intensifying militarism that we have in our Americas. To get us into this conversation, though, we have some outstanding presenters with us this evening. We have Netfa Freeman, who's been involved in the movement to end the U.S. blockade of Cuba since 1993. He's traveled to the country several times. He was a founding member and lead organizer in both the D.C. Havana Sister City Project and the No War on Cuba movement. Currently, Netfa is an organizer in the International Committee for Peace, Justice, and Dignity. That was formerly the International Committee for the Freedom of the Cuba Five. And he has written several articles and done a number of media interviews on Cuba. Netfa is also a member of the Black Alliance for Peace, representing a very powerful and important organization, the Pan-African Community Action. Then we're going to have James Patrick Jordan. James Jordan is a longtime activist. He has lived in Tucson, Arizona since 1983. He has a long history of grassroots organizing. His main duties, he is with the Alliance for Global Justice. He's a facilitator for labor, ecological, and Colombian solidarity campaigns. He serves on the board of Liberty Tree Foundation and represents the Alliance and is part of the People's Human Rights Observatory and the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Bases, which is part of the broader coalition that we all are a part of. So I'd like to thank both of our presenters for joining us this evening. Just to provide a little bit of background and context for this conversation, we want to, as you know, this is a call that's being sponsored by the Black Alliance for Peace. The Black Alliance for Peace is a fairly new formation. We launched this formation in April of last year, April the 4th to be exact. And we saw that as an important date to launch the attempt to begin to revive the traditional black anti-war movement, because of course that was the date that Dr. King came out in opposition to the Vietnam War, took a courageous and somewhat late position on the war, but something nevertheless that was very important. It was a historic turning point in the efforts to end the criminal activity of the U.S. state in Vietnam. So we thought that was the appropriate date for us to attempt to begin to revive the black anti-war efforts. We saw this as part of our attempts to try to be part of the movement to revive the broader anti-war movement, if you will, here in the U.S. And we saw these efforts as really timely because it's a consequence of the changes that have occurred politically in this country with the ascendancy of Donald Trump and with what many of us believe to be sort of a new awakening, or maybe perhaps people coming out of a 8-year fog under the Obama administration. We thought that this was a timely period to begin to really refocus in on U.S. militarism, war making, and our concerns and opposition to U.S. imperialism. The tagline for the Black Alliance for Peace is that this is a people-centered human rights project that is opposed to war, repression, and imperialism. So we are bringing back into the conversation among left forces in the U.S. The absolute necessity for opposing U.S. warmongering, but also U.S. imperialism. And that's important, my friends, because, despite, the concerns we have, and we all have real concerns about the Trump administration, we find that there's not been a fundamental departure from the ruling class strategy, if you will, reflected in Trump's national security strategy. No real change from the overall strategy that's been followed by every individual who sat and sits in that office for the last 20 years, the office of the presidency. But basically, their main objective is to maintain U.S. hegemony. The only difference today is that the military option seems to be a much more centered piece of their strategy to maintain U.S. hegemony. So we believe that the only way that we're going to be able to put a break on that is to, in fact, revive a militant anti-war movement here in this country. Toward that process, we have the Black Alliance for Peace, along with a number of organizations, came together to create a campaign that was launched last month or in January in Baltimore, building a new coalition called the No U.S. Foreign Bases Coalition. We launched this coalition in January in Baltimore, and we see this as an entry point to a larger conversation around the role of U.S. empire, using this campaign as an opportunity to remind people or to make people aware of the fact that we have a nation state, the U.S., that has between 800 and 1,000 bases, depending on how one defines bases, worldwide. And that we are calling for the U.S. to close those bases, bring the troops back to the U.S., and to use that $156 billion to maintain those bases to address the material needs of people right back here in this country. So coming out of that launching of that campaign, that coalition to make people aware of the U.S. And its empire making around the globe, there was a resolution that came out of the conference that said that one of the dates that we wanted to highlight in making people aware of U.S. militarism and its basing system around the world was February 23rd. February 23rd represents the 115th year that the U.S. has seized and held on to Guantanamo Bay and the naval base there in Guantanamo, Cuba. And we thought this was an important opportunity to raise up that issue, to remind the people that Guantanamo is not the U.S. Guantanamo belongs to the people of Cuba. We thought this was important, especially in light of the recent decision by the Trump administration that is now committed to keeping Guantanamo open. So we want to talk about Guantanamo, but we also want to connect up Guantanamo to our larger concerns, as I said earlier. The fact of the matter is that when we talk about militarism in the Americas, we often sometimes don't think about the Caribbean area. We want people to be reminded that Cuba is in the Caribbean. There is a significant U.S. presence in the Caribbean area, and we want people to be aware of that. So we call for closing the Guantanamo. We also want to close all of these various bases that we find in the Caribbean. Now, this is important for a number of reasons, of course. We know that U.S. aggression and militarism in the Caribbean is not something new. We all remember, at least many of us remember, of the activities of the U.S. invading and smashing up progressive and revolutionary experiences in places like Grenada in 1983. We know the kind of reactionary militarism we saw in Nicaragua during the Contra Wars, and in El Salvador and Guatemala. We remember the invasion of Panama to arrest a sitting president that resulted in the complete destruction of a black community in that country. And we know about the ongoing reaction in Haiti and the attempts by the U.S. to control the political situation in that country, and to, in fact, be involved in various coups that have very clear military components. And we know about the ongoing presence, even though the people have risen up to reject a lot of this, but we know that there's an ongoing presence in territory being held in Puerto Rico by the U.S. military. And we know, of course, about the situation in places like Colombia and Plan Colombia, and that notorious School of the Americas, where they train various military forces to suppress their own citizens throughout Latin America. So, for us, these are very important issues, in particular for us as African people or black people who are part of the 150 million black people in the Caribbean and the Americas. The issue of U.S. militarism has a direct impact on us. Not only the fact of it having a direct impact on black people throughout the Americas, but that part of the Americas in North America, the territory of the U.S., in those spaces where we find ourselves colonized and under military occupation by the domestic military force that many of us refer to as the police. So these connections are connections we're going to be making in the Black Alliance for Peace. These are the connections that have us to focus in on the Americas, but also have us focus in on Africa and AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command. And we make those connections because we understand that the militarism we see beyond the borders of the U.S. Is the flip side of the same coin, the flip side of the police state that we have to confront here in the U.S. And that coin is the coin of continued white supremacist, colonial, capitalist, patriarchal domination. And we name the enemy for us because we don't have the luxury to play games because this oppressive force is responsible for mayhem, death, and destruction on a global level. And therefore, solidarity and honesty requires that we are absolutely clear in who we are and what kinds of forces we are up against and who the enemy is at this current stage in history. So that's why we're here tonight, my friend, and that's what we're going to talk about in our conversation. Now, we're going to turn this over to Brother Netfa, who's going to talk about the historic connection between Cuba and the U.S., in particular black people or African people in the U.S., and that will be followed by James, who's going to expand the conversation and talk about the Caribbean and Latin America area in general. So let's turn the mic over to Brother Netfa Freeman.
Thank you, Ajamu. Good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be addressing everybody. I'll make this as quickly as possible. It's a very packed subject for this, but I think the first thing for us to understand, and I think it's important for a lot of people to understand, it's not as well understood by more people, is that Cuba is really overwhelmingly, or significantly, should I say, an African country or a black country in terms of its population. Now, I'm not going to talk so much about that, but that a large African or black population there has been significantly involved in Cuba since its independence and getting independence from Spain, and started the first party of independence of people of color there. But and then the ideological ideologically, the revolutionary Cuba identifies with Africa. From the first time that Fidel Castro made the statement, "We have the blood of Africa running through our veins," in the 1970s, referring to their commitment to help our liberation struggles and independence movements on the continent of Africa. So that's very significant. Now, so that leads me to the next thing. Significantly, one of the things, and it's not necessarily, it's indirectly related to the relationship of Africans, black people here in the U.S. and Cuba, is Cuba's very valiant and unconditional support for our liberation movements on the continent of Africa. Before I say that, one of the first things that happened is when Cuba had its independence, won its revolution in 1959, right there in 1960 following it, not even a year into the revolution, almost a year, Fidel Castro and a delegation of Cubans came to New York for a United Nations meeting. And after not being able to really find a hotel and a place to stay, they found out that the Hotel Teresa, people might know about, it's a historic stay that Fidel and his delegation stayed in Hotel Teresa in Harlem. Now, people might think, well, okay, this delegation, they couldn't have any place to stay, and then when they found out there was a place to stay, they kind of hesitantly said, okay, wow, I guess so if that's the only place. But actually, it was the opposite reaction from Fidel. It was a reaction of welcoming it and seeing it as an opportunity to connect with the disenfranchised and the African community. And in that historic relationship, or that historic incident, Fidel was able to actually meet with Malcolm X, and also even a number of the delegates that were coming from other countries to participate in United Nations meeting came to the Hotel Teresa to meet with, and particularly, namely, Kwame Nkrumah was one. And so that also sort of was one of the things that helped also Malcolm X, and that particular United Nations meeting helped Malcolm X even expand further his internationalism and his Pan-Africanism, being able to make direct contacts with people in Africa, in the African liberation struggle, and newly independent countries and whatnot. Another thing that actually goes right into that is Kwame Ture, also formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, the late Kwame Ture, first visited Cuba in 1967. It's a significant trip. He was at that time a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and in some respects, that Cuba visit and that conference that he was there going to attend provided SNCC with their first substantive contact with the African liberation movements. Because a lot of the African liberation movements were attending this conference in Cuba, and for some reason, the name of it's escaping me right now, the Organization of Solidarity and something conference. And so they were able to meet with delegates from South Africa, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and these are what we call, often referred to as frontline states, Angola, who are actually still engaged in armed struggle to overthrow apartheid and capitalism and imperialism. But that also means Egypt, Guinea, Algeria. All of those were also observers in the conference, and Kwame was able to meet with them, which actually impacted our liberation movement right here in this country in terms of helping to internationalize it. And then what I talked about earlier, began with, was Cuba's unconditional support for our liberation struggles on the continent of Africa in the form of military combatants. During the 60s and 70s, as people know, that a lot of our countries were struggling for independence or trying to maintain their independence in the face of forces trying to overthrow it. So in the Congo, Cuba dispatched, so people know that a lot of people may know of Che Guevara's historic visit and helping to aid and give consultation or direction, or anyway, just being able to help them with advisor to their struggle there, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, helping them address the issue of the Portuguese, and this is as early as 1960s. We're talking about 1960s. 1961, I believe, was the first time that Cuba went there unconditionally, where we have other countries going into, the U.S. and other Western countries going to invade and to dominate. Cuba's mission was to give unconditional support to the liberation movements. There's a saying. There's two sayings that are kind of infamous in those who know about it. One is the only thing that Cuba took from Africa when they went there was, and I'm paraphrasing it, is the bodies of the combatants who died in the struggle. So in other words, to say they didn't go away to go there with diamonds or anything like that. And the other one was, when Africa called, Cuba answered. And so these are pretty renowned sayings, and they reflect Cuba's unconditional support, which is now, and then one of the most notable battles, and I'll almost wrap up, is the battle where they returned to Angola. They helped Angola and returning Angola in 1988, around that time, and then helped in a decisive battle to help Angola defeat South Africa, apartheid South Africa at that time, with the Battle of Quito Carnaval. And that was very decisive, and also is known, accredited by the liberation forces in South Africa as helping to weaken South Africa to help also turn over apartheid. And so these are very significant contributions that Cuba has made. And then directly in the United States, we can see that Cuba has granted asylum to black liberation organizers within the U.S., like namely Robert and Mabel Williams, who were struggling in Monroe, North Carolina, with the North NAACP, Assata Shakur, who's very famous, or pretty renowned in those of us who are who know about the struggle there, along with Nehanda Al-Boyadun. The both of them having political asylum, and asylum recently when the negotiations for normalized relations are opened up under the Obama administration and Raul Castro. People were wondering if Cuba would extradite Assata and Nehanda, and they equivocally said no. We have the right to. They stand on their principles to give political asylum to anyone, and there's no extradition treaty, and you're not going to make us do anything in terms of compromising our principles. It was a very noble and admirable thing for them to do, and they've been just even giving them asylum in general is admirable. And the last thing, or a couple of things, is the medical and literacy programs. Now, instead of having to not really engage so much with Africa and the world in terms of military combatants, now the symbol there is quickly turning the symbol of military of revolutionaries with a gun and the sickle and everything to young people with stethoscopes. So they have dispatched thousands of medical people around the world, particularly in Africa and places where the doctors and the medical professionals, within those countries, won't even go to treat people who are denied or don't have access to health care, even in the bush, the places that are very rural, and places that are just very, have no access to health care. As well as a literacy program, which I'll just say really quickly. Time is up. But really quickly, Cuba created a remarkable literacy program where they declared to the United Nations, Fidel declared in 1960 that the country would eradicate illiteracy in 1 year, and they actually did it. And as a product of that very profound literacy program, they've been able to develop some astounding pedagogies for teaching people how to read and write. And that's not as heard of as the medical programs, but they do both now. They actually help other countries with those two things, medical medicine and literacy, as well as training, giving scholarships completely free of charge to African people in the U.S. who studied medicine, and Cuba's renowned School of Medicine, completely free of charge scholarships to people, and all they ask of those students is to come back and use their skills for the benefit of the most disenfranchised in their communities. And so these are the contributions And often it's said that revolutionaries, the biggest crime that we can make is to be ungrateful. And so many of us see that we have a political obligation to stand up and defeat the U.S. blockade against Cuba, and also to make sure that its territory, Guantanamo, is returned to it. So that's all I have, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Netfa. It's quite clear that, and we want to make sure that everyone on this call understands that for us, this is not a esoteric issue. This is an issue that is deeply connected to the historic struggles of not only Black people, but the historic struggles of people who have correctly identified that we're not going to be able to address our material needs to transform ourselves as long as we attempt to try to be in harmony with this oppressive system emanating from North America. So thank you so much, Netfa. Before we go to James, though, I would like for Michael to come on and very briefly just share with us some of the technical information that we need to have as we go forward in this call. So Michael, can you do that?
Yes. Hi, folks. All right, so we're using the Maestro conference technology provided by InterOccupy, which I'm a member of. And what it is you can communicate with us via your phone keypad, or if you're using Skype, you can do it right on the keypad of Skype as well. A little bit later in the call, we're going to be getting on Stack. If you have any questions for our presenters, to get on Stack, you just press the number 1. And for tonight, for the most part, that's all we're going to need is just knowing get on Stack, press the number 1. I see that a lot of you have not gotten on the visual interface, and if you do have access to a computer where you could be on the call and also on the visual interface, that'd be great. To get onto that, you can do one of two things. In your email that sent the reminder with the PIN, there's a link to the visual interface. The one from InterOccupy, it'll be blue and says visual interface. You can click that, and it'll bring you to the to the page where you log in. Or if you just want to open up a browser window and type in social.maestroconference.com and then nothing after the M, and that's MAESTRO conference.com. So social.maestroconference.com, and then you put in the email you registered with your PIN. You'll be signed on to the social webinar. And later on in this call, there's a couple tweets we have queued up that we can push out on the social webinar, as well as there's some links on there as well, and a common doc where everyone can share thoughts, notes, ideas, and all kinds of things collectively work together and brainstorm as a common document. So that's all for now, and thank you very much. If anyone has any trouble with getting on the social webinar, you can press the number 5, and I'll pull you into a breakout and try to help you out with the tech stuff. So thank you. I yield.
Thank you so much, Michael, and we really thank InterOccupy for providing this support to us. This kind of solidarity is really, really important, and we couldn't really do this without that. So thank you so much again, Michael. Now we're going to bring Brother James to talk about to expand our vision, our perspective on what is happening in the Caribbean and entire Latin America area. And so I've already introduced James, so we'll let James go ahead and to share his information with the call. James?
Hi. Well, first of all, I just want to say that I'm really happy to be here and be meeting with everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about military bases and the whole infrastructure of the empire, really an infrastructure that plays out globally. Of course, with the Alliance for Global Justice and my work, we're very focused on Latin America and the Caribbean. But when we look at the big picture of empire, which by empire I mean a U.S. NATO transnational corporate empire. I think it's fair to say that when we're looking at the big picture, that the thumbtacks that are holding up that big picture are the U.S. and NATO military bases and other forms of military presence and interventions. I think it's also fair to say that it's a good struggle to be focused on, because if we pull out those thumbtacks, the whole big picture comes tumbling down. We also know that thumbtacks at the top of the picture are more important than the ones at the bottom. You pull out the ones at the bottom, the picture may flop around the wind. You pull them out at the top and its fall falls over. And Guantanamo is one of the thumbtacks at the top. It's a nail right in the heart of people's democracy and a socialist and ecologically sustainable nation that the empire desperately wants to fail. Also in the Caribbean, if we look at Haiti, it was occurring to me that that's a very concrete example of just how the infrastructure of empire plays out. In a very real way, the story of Haiti is a microcosm for the world, and it's a story of all liberation struggles, and we all have reason to be inspired by and to learn from Haiti. I was recently reading Ana Esther Cesena. She published a piece in 2013 for the Ecuadorian Ministry of Defense, where she really sums up the objectives of the United States and Latin America, saying that the U.S. has two general objectives: to guarantee the maintenance of capitalism, and within it the primacy of the United States, and to guarantee the availability of all the riches of the world as a material base for the functioning of the system, assuring that its hierarchies and dynamics of power are maintained. So the U.S. has been successful in establishing bases in several countries throughout Latin America. There are formally recognized bases in El Salvador, of course in Guantanamo, Aruba, Curacao, Antigua and Barbuda, Andros Island in the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, even a micro base or lily pad in Costa Rica. And as you can see, so many of those bases that have been recognized and around for a while are right in the Caribbean. Nevertheless, there's been a strong movement throughout Latin America against the military bases that resulted in several important closures and setbacks for the empire. But now the pendulum is swinging the other way. With the coup in Honduras in 2009, part of the motivation for that coup was that Manuel Zelaya wanted to convert the Pomarola Air Force Base into a civilian airport. But since the coup, there's been new construction on that Air Force Base and a huge increase in the number of troops and civilian employees from the United States there. Also, since the coup, the U.S. has built a base at Carrasca in the Mosquitia region of Honduras and in Guanaja, a U.S. Navy facility. Besides Honduras, there's a new base that's being built in Peru, in the Amazon region. In Brazil, President Michel Temer has invited the U.S. to use the Alcantara missile and rocket launching base, and I believe that's U.S. and NATO both have access to that base. Samuel Pinheiro Guimarães, Brazil's former General Secretary of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Strategic Affairs, has said that the Americans' main objective is to have a military base in Brazilian territory where it can exercise its sovereignty outside the laws of Brazil, and that the location of Alcantara in the Brazilian northeast facing West Africa is ideal for the United States for its political and military operations in South America and Africa. In Argentina, there are two bases that are being built or have already been built as of May 2016 was when the agreement was made. One of them is in the border area of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, which is the world's largest reservoir of drinkable fresh water. These bases, of course, they threaten Venezuela, they threaten Cuba, they threaten all the countries. They threaten not just Latin America, they are bases that can reach into Africa and the Middle East. The presence of U.S. military bases, however, again, they're just the thumbtacks. There's a whole infrastructure of empire. We know that after U.S. military invasions, these are almost always followed by passages of laws that undermine traditional farming, the diversion of water resources, laws that undermine traditional farming in favor of the diversion of water resources and the exploitation of mineral and oil wealth. U.S. occupations inevitably lead to militarization of police and borders and construction of and design of penitentiary systems based on a U.S. mass incarceration model. I did a lot of research about this in the few days, and I actually delineated 14 different components that I see as constituting the basic repeated infrastructure of empire. I'm going to skip over those right now, just to stay within my allotted time. Maybe I'll come back to them and delineate them more. But I want to look at Haiti, where we see several. We actually see all these components being played out, but I'll just add in a few. First of all, the very history of Haiti just shows how embedded racism is in the histories of the United States and Europe and empire, and how much empire is motivated by racism. We can look at Haiti with all the class analysis and other analysis in the world and still not adequately explain the viciousness and abuse that North America and Europe have visited on that country. Haiti again and again has shown itself capable of governing itself, only to be slapped down. Since the 1990s, the U.S. has directly invaded Haiti 2 different times, 1994 and 20 times. The first time in the name of defending Haiti's democracy, the second time in the name of disaster aid. In 2004, the U.S. orchestrated a coup against Haiti's elected government. With all of these events, we see these components of empire being put in place. In 1994, the Clinton administration invaded Haiti to reinstate President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and he's a great man, dedicated to and loved by the Haitian people. But the U.S. government, when the U.S. government gets involved, they're never simply being friends of democracy or being motivated by altruistic impulses. And after the invasion of 94, the Clinton administration imposed neoliberal policies on Haiti that reduced tariffs on foreign rice from 3% or from 50% to 3%. As of 1987, Haiti produced 75% of its rice. Now it imports more than 80% of its rice from the U.S. In 2010, the U.S. Marines went in after, in the name of disaster relief. Contrary to reports in the corporate media, what we heard from our contacts following the earthquake were about many, many scenes of people helping people. And into this massive outpouring and spontaneous outpouring of mutual aid, the U.S. Marines came in, began arresting children looking for food in the streets, turning away fully equipped airplanes sent by Doctors Without Borders, and flying helicopters over the heads of Haitians, telling the crowds that they should not come to the U.S. as refugees. That invasion was also followed by another flood of the country with Haitian rice. Monsanto donated hundreds of tons of hybrid seeds to Haitian farmers that would not result in fertile seeds for another generation, therefore creating dependency. The U.S. military almost always follows invasions with threats to traditional agriculture. This is something we really miss a lot, but it's something that's happened in Colombia. Invasions, occupations, presences, it's happened in Colombia, it happened in Iraq, it's happened in Haiti. and couched between the invasions of, well, I want to say after the 1994, the Haitian military was disbanded because of its repressive history and its role in so many coups. Last November, it was reinstated. The U.S. is currently involved in training Haitian law enforcement and the new military, just as it is in the Dominican Republic. In 2004, there was the overthrow of the Aristide government. And it's interesting because you have the military going in the name of humanitarian aid and disaster relief, which you would think would be what the State Department would be doing, or USAID. But in this case, the U.S. State Department funded the organizations that initiated, conceived, provided training and direction for the coup. Basically, they funded the International Republican Institute. There was also collusion by the AFL-CIO's Solidarity Center, which was funding a labor organization that refused to defend Aristide and called for the end of the administration, while they are ignoring the largest union that was allied with Aristide, hunting them down and killing them in the streets. The Haitian authorities after the coup authorities. So we also see with Haiti that the school-to-prison pipeline is not just a U.S. phenomenon. Following the coup, well, first of all, the coup was against an administration that had built more schools than all the combined Haitian leaderships in history, against an administration that had created Haiti's first medical school. After the coup, many schools wound up being closed down. Education is very privatized, and the medical school was turned into a base of operations for the coup. Meanwhile, the U.S. became more involved than ever in building Haitians' prison systems, and Robert Roth, who's a friend of ours and an activist in San Francisco, has written that the Haitian government had a solution for their crisis in education: more prison. There are now more than 10,000 Haitians locked up in prison, the majority of whom have never been charged or sentenced. So that is another aspect, component of empire, and it's something that is imposed by, United States designs and with our funding. I've covered many, not all of the components of the infrastructure of empire, and rather than delve into that further right now, I just want to return briefly and touch on Cuba and Guantanamo. Haiti has benefited so much from both Cuba and Venezuela. When I was in Haiti, I saw how Cuba had built the kind of infrastructure that furthers the cost of independence, building electric plants, markets for peasant farmers, an airport, providing Cuban doctors who had been teachers in the medical schools, training Cuban or Haitian students in Cuba. That's the kind of infrastructure of liberation, which is the counter to the infrastructure of empire. And there are reasons that the whole of the Caribbean is... One more minute. There's reasons that the whole of the Caribbean is dotted with U.S. military bases and installations. It has to do with containing the positive influence of countries like Cuba and the ALBA countries, several of which are Caribbean. They're all obstacles to empire and what it considers its own backyard. If we can unite with Latin American and Caribbean movements and movements worldwide and remove those thumbtacks that reinforce the whole big picture of empire, that's a powerful thing. But I would say that the biggest picture is our resistance and our liberation. And I do believe that we can take down the big picture of empire and replace it with one that is more just, more sustainable, more peaceful, and more beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James. Before we turn to the Q&A, I just wanted to make sure that people, to let you know that this event is in fact being recorded. So you can know that before you, in fact, raise your hand for questions. So, and also too, we want to let people know that that there'll be some tweets that will be popping up that you can share for those of you who are on the visual interface. So just be aware of that also. So we're going to start taking stack now for the question part, comment part. We would like for folks to please be mindful of the time and try to limit your question or comment to 1 minute. We have a lot of folks who want to get in. So you hit number 1, and that will identify you so that you can be let into the conversation. So all you have to do is hit number 1, and that will, your hand will come up, and we could add you to the stack. So let's go ahead and start. As we are getting the stack together, I mean, one thing that one very important piece of information that of much that James and Netfa shared with us, but one thing that really stuck out in my mind just in the last minute or so was that figure that very few people know about of the 10,000 individuals in Haiti that are in prison as part of a repressive environment that we see in Haiti as a consequence of the earthquake and the what many Haitians refer to as an occupation by international forces, primarily through the UN. That is a really pathetic situation. So again, as you're hitting, as the comments are coming in, please hit number 1 on your telephone keypad, and that will identify you, and then we can come to you for questions. Okay, so we have Margaret or Kevin.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I wanted to see if any of the 3 of you have any comments on what's going on in Venezuela right now. There's been, Tillerson just did a tour. There's talk of a military coup. There's indications of potentially a military attack by the United States and other countries. Anyone have any news or thoughts on what's being talked about or we're hearing about regarding Venezuela? Thanks.
Thank you. If it's all right with the other presenters, I wouldn't mind making a comment about that. Some of you may have, may be aware, I did write a piece about what is unfolding in Venezuela and the concerns that many of us have regarding the real possibility of some kind of external intervention into Venezuela. One of the most disappointing aspects of the situation in Venezuela for me has been the response or non-response, if you will, coming from progressive and radical forces in the U.S. Here we have a country, a people that are attempting to build a process that they believe will address the needs of their people, that will satisfy their desire for a people's democracy, that would result in a more equitable, equal and fair distribution of resources, but they have not been allowed to develop their process as a consequence of the constant efforts at destabilization coming from the United States. And now they are facing the real possibility of a more violent intervention because it's quite clear to many of us that the U.S. has encouraged the oligarchy there in Venezuela to opt for a coup intervention as opposed to a peaceful resolution of the issues that are facing the country. We believe that the window for a violent intervention is open now because it's quite clear that the U.S. Does not want to see the scheduled presidential elections for April 22nd to go forward. And so we're really concerned, and I know people in Venezuela are really concerned about the possibility of a violent intervention, even in the form of some kind of internal forces that will attempt to overthrow the state, because we know that if that happens, it in fact will be a bloodbath in that country. So anybody else from the presenters who might want to comment on that?
Well, I'm just concerned. I think we have a lot of reason to be worried. I'm sure Kevin and Margaret probably know more about the latest than I do, but I know that in Colombia right now there have been 2,000 troops that have been sent to an area very important on the other side of the country, very important to the peace process, and that is raising much concern. But there's also been something like 2,000 troops sent over on the Colombia-Venezuela border, and during and following the tour by Rex Tillerson, the head of Southcom went to both areas and met with troops and met with Colombian leaders, so very concerned. This is also on the heels of recent largest military exercise in history in the Amazon region of Brazil, which many people interpret as a attempt to intimidate, threaten Venezuela.
Yeah, that's very worrying. Once again, folks, you hit on your dial pad number 1 so that you can be recognized before we go to the next caller. I think we need to remind ourselves of the importance of Venezuela for the progressive motion that we see in Latin America. The U.S. is quite strategic when it targets certain states. Many of us are always concerned that as a consequence of the U.S. being tied up in its adventures in the so-called Middle East, that eventually it would turn the full focus of its repressive apparatus against the state of Venezuela because of the role that Venezuela was playing and plays in terms of being at the forefront of a general progressive movement of peoples in Latin America, in South America, so-called South America. And of course, that eventually happened. It happened under the so-called progressive administration of Barack Obama. The Obama administration declared that Venezuela was a threat to national security. And we saw the screws being slowly turned on that country. And then with the untimely demise of Hugo Chavez, we saw that was intensified. So, we have this targeting of Venezuela as part of a general counter-revolutionary motion, counter-revolutionary process. But yet the response from would-be allies in the U.S. has been complete. Well, I wouldn't say complete, but in general, it's not been the kind of response that we would have seen 25 years ago. And I think it's reflective of the rightist character of politics in the U.S. That has impacted every aspect of U.S. society, even the so-called left. Left in the U.S. has moved to the right. So that there is now open collaboration, in my opinion, among left forces with the U.S. state. And I say open collaboration because if one is not in opposition to these interventionist moves by the state, then in essence you are in fact a collaborator. You are a supporter of these efforts. So this is very, very troubling that the people of Venezuela are having to stand up to both the U.S. but also to NATO. One of the most backward things that happened with Venezuela was, the positions taken by activists in Europe also, who, have been silent or have given support to the violent opposition in Venezuela. So, we have a serious situation. To me, I think the situation with Venezuela is probably represents the most serious challenge to the progress that we've made here in the Americas that currently exist. So again, number one on your keypads, if you have a comment or a question. So let me.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Margaret.
This is Margaret. Yeah, I was the next person on stack, if that's okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you to Netfa and James for really excellent presentations. I wanted to just build on the comment that Ajamu made and ask you about this, because it's really interesting to me that sometimes when we are talking to people who identify in the U.S. as being progressive, and we talk about the U.S. being an empire, they'll say, oh, but we're a benevolent or, benign empire, and, which just couldn't be farther from the truth. And there's also this myth out there that, the United States creates crises in countries like Venezuela. We have certainly played a role in creating the economic crisis there, and then use these crises to justify humanitarian interventions and humanitarian wars. And I'm just wondering if Netfa and James can kind of talk a little bit about kind of these myths of the benign empire, humanitarian wars, how we address these with people in the progressive community. Over.
Mm-hmm. So can you hear me?
Yes.
How do I? Okay. I didn't know if I was one that had to raise my hand or something. So it's a very good question. I think that one thing is, it's interesting that we're talking about Cuba because it's one country that really turns that on its head particularly in terms of its medical and these literacy programs, and the fact that missions, the United States missions, always include occupying forces, people that are occupying, and there are many other countries, not even just Cuba, that have human rights human rights that are guaranteed to their people that the U.S. doesn't even have. There are some countries, and we should be able to bring this kind of stuff up. For example, I think we should advocate for, instead of some of the stuff they're teaching our young people in school about the Constitution and all this U.S. American exceptionalism, we should be learning about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We should be learning about how countries actually take articles from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter and make it part of their constitutions, like Cuba and like Venezuela, for example. When we read their constitutions, they guarantee things and then say that it's guaranteed by they lift it right off of there. And so we should be able to do that. I think there's when we deal with the most impacted, the most disenfranchised, the most repressed of people in this country, it's not a stretch to help them realize that, it's no stretch to help people realize this is no benevolence here when we talk about that. Even little children really get it. My daughter one time when she was little said to me, "How are they bombing this country and saying that they're helping them?" And it's so it can be pretty evident, and sometimes we have to make because people. Well, one thing, young people are not. They're not indoctrinated in such a way that there's a lot of what you call cognitive dissonance and things that kind of older people have. But we need to be able to get to the people who have been indoctrinated more, and there's ways to do it if we just show. One, we have to study and show the very clear contradictions that this country, what they demonstrate versus what they, what they have. And then yeah. So anyway, that's my response to that.
Yeah, I would just add that there is no benevolent empire. We know the history of the U.S. and the millions of people that have died as a result of its imperial designs. But we just look at Haiti, first of all. That's a perfect example of what happens when invasions are carried out in the name of disaster relief and humanitarian aid. Haiti is just one example. The U.S. military is not an efficient bringer of disaster relief or humanitarian aid, and it never has been. And why is the military doing that sort of a thing anyway? That's not supposed to be its mission. But we have a growing development. I mean, the whole U.S. military adventure right now is based mainly on pursuing non-traditional, non-specific targets for engagement that can never be truly defeated, but lead to a constant state of high alert, unending wars, and unending occupations. And I think when we look at this huge exercise in disaster relief that took place in Brazil recently near the border of with Venezuela, I think we have to look at that and realize that is much as that is more so an exercise in rapid deployment of large temporary bases than it has anything to do with disaster relief. We just look at the record; it's not true, and we should denounce that every time that we can. So I just wanted to add, the U.S. State Department, in the name of the war on drugs, pours millions of dollars into building prisons and in militarizing the border, that sort of thing. And in the name of the war on drugs, for instance, the U.S. State Department is building prisons in Iraq. What has Iraq ever had to do in any major way with narco-trafficking? You see this in many countries where it's an excuse, and you can look at the drug war. It's a hollow excuse for more domination, and that follows over into the humanitarian aid and disaster relief area as well.
Thank you so much, James. So look, let's we have gone now more than an hour, and so what we want to do now is to allow for the two presenters to provide a 1-minute closing. Then I'm going to close with a couple of comments that I'd like people to really pay attention to also. So let's go Netfa and then James.
I don't really have much to say. I just appreciate being on the call, and I think I learned a lot from James and even from your presentation, Ajamu. So hopefully we can build some really concrete, formidable projects and campaigns to address what this militarization in the U.S. and Guantanamo.
Thank you, James. Any closing comments?
Well, I really enjoyed being on here and have learned a lot from both of you and the comments, and that's all been very good. What I would just encourage people, first of all, people can, of course, come to the various websites we represent, including ours. It's afgj.org, Alliance for Global Justice, so afgj.org to find out ways to get involved. But I would encourage everybody to get involved with the No Foreign Bases Coalition, noforeignbases.org, and support the upcoming days of action in April, because it's looking to me like this is a coalition that could come together and help revitalize the peace movement in the U.S. and around the world. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you so much, James. And I want to thank everybody, and just to follow up, I want everyone to in fact check out the websites that you have been exposed to. please go to the No Foreign Bases site and consider being a part of this new coalition. We are struggling to close all of the U.S. foreign bases and to bring those resources back to the U.S. Of course, please consider joining or, in fact, supporting the Black Alliance for Peace. We are a struggling alliance of grassroots organizers and organizations. We have no resources. We have not attempted to secure any foundation resources. We exist primarily as a consequence of your participation, your support. So please keep that support coming. And consider, if you haven't, to join the Black Alliance for Peace if you're of African descent, or to be a supporter if you're not. And we have work for everybody in each one of those categories. This is the first of our quarterly calls. We're going to have another call on April the 4th in commemoration of, not commemoration, I guess, but to raise the assassination of Dr. King, and to talk about what that means and how we go forward in building a militant anti-war movement. I echo what James said about being a part of the No Bases Coalition, but also be a part, consider joining the United National Anti-War Coalition, which is the national umbrella of organizations also. We are also organizing, all of us who are part of this emerging and re-emerging anti-war movement here in the U.S., we're encouraging people to consider organizing some kind of local, state, or regional activity on either April 13th or 14th to demonstrate that there is, in fact, an anti-war presence here in this country. So please consider organizing something like that. You can go to the No Bases website. You can come to the BAP website. Go to the UNAC website to get information and materials on how to go forward in organizing an event in your area. There is another important campaign that we are part of, is Divest from the Military. The anchor of that group is Code Pink. The idea is a very progressive one, and that is to put pressure on various institutions, schools, pension funds, local administrations, state legislatures to divest from the military, to divest from investment portfolios where there is investment in and with companies that are making a profit from the war industry. So there's a lot that we can do, folks. We have to make sure we integrate this anti-war perspective in all of our work. We've got to continue to raise this issue, especially in light of the fact that there is a bipartisan support for warmongering here in this country. So the only way that we're going to put a break on that and bring back some sanity and to live up to our responsibility of being at the center of empire is for us to intensify our anti-war work, our anti-imperialist work here in this country. So, folks, thank you so much for joining us. Be on the lookout for information for our next call, and we want to thank you. And everybody's mic will be open, and you can say to all your friends and comrades to have a good night and a good weekend. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Okay. Thanks, comrades.
Great call. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Excellent. Good night.
Good night.